Adopted in 1705, the Virginia Slave Code stated, "All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves in the Dominion shall be considered real property. If a slave resists his master, who applies corrective measures to such slave, and if, in the course of correction, the slave is killed, the master shall be exempt from all punishment." As if nothing of the kind had happened at all. The code also prohibited slaves from leaving the plantation without written permission. It authorized flogging, branding, and mutilation as punishment for even minor transgressions. Some codes prohibited teaching slaves to read and write. In Georgia, this offense was punishable by fine and/or flogging if the offender was a Negro slave or colored free man. Although the plight of American slaves was harsh, the material conditions under which they labored were in many ways comparable to those experienced by many European workers and peasants at the same time. But there was also a difference. Slaves were deprived of their freedom. The first blacks were brought to America as indentured laborers, but very soon the indentured system was officially replaced by the more profitable system of slavery. In 1641 in Massachusetts, slaves were made to serve for life, and a 1661 law in Virginia made maternal slavery hereditary for children. Similar laws enshrining slavery were passed in Maryland, 1663, in New York, 1665, in South, 1682, and North Carolina, 1715, etc. Thus Negroes became slaves. Until the end of the 17th century, the slave trade in the English colonies in America was the monopoly of the Royal African Company, but in 1698 this monopoly was abolished, and the colonies were allowed to engage in the slave trade independently. The slave trade became even more extensive after 1713, when England won the right of asiento, the exclusive right to trade in Negro slaves. Negroes were caught, bought, goods were exchanged for them, they were loaded into the stinking holds of ships and taken to America. Slaves died en masse in the barracks of the factories and during transport. But although for every surviving Negro there were often 5 who died on the road, suffocated from lack of air, died of disease, went mad, or simply threw themselves into the sea, preferring death to slavery, the slave traders made fabulous profits. The demand for Negroes was so great, and slaves were so cheap and paid for themselves so quickly. Negroes were so cheap that it was more profitable for planters to torture a slave into hard labor in a short period of time than to exploit him longer but more carefully. The average life expectancy of a slave on plantations in some parts of the South did not exceed 6 or 7 years. Despite the prohibition of the importation of slaves in 1808, the slave trade did not cease. It continued in a hidden form until the official emancipation of blacks during the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Negroes were now being smuggled in, further increasing the death rate in transit. It is estimated that between 1808 and 1860, about 500,000 slaves were smuggled into the United States. The subject of the trade was, in addition, Negroes specially bred for sale in some slave states of the South, especially South Carolina and Virginia. Negroes were made slaves, but they were never submissive slaves. It was not uncommon for Negroes to revolt while still on ships. This is evidenced by a special type of insurance by shipowners to cover losses specifically in case slaves revolted on the ship. But even on plantations, where Negroes brought from different parts of Africa, representatives of different tribes, speaking different languages, lived, slaves managed to overcome intertribal discord and unite in the fight against their common enemy, planters. Thus, already in 1663 and 1687 large conspiracies of Negroes in Virginia were revealed, and in 1712 the garrison of New York with great difficulty managed to prevent the capture of the city by rebellious slaves, Negroes. Between 1663 and 1863, when Negro slavery was abolished, over 250 Negro rebellions and conspiracies are recorded, including such major ones as the rebellions led by Cato, 1739, in Stono, South Carolina, Gabriel, sometimes called Gabriel Prosser after his master's name, 1800, at Henrico, Virginia, Denmark Vesey, 1822, at Charleston, South Carolina, and Nat Turner, 1831, at Southampton, Virginia. Negro uprisings were brutally suppressed. But even these scattered outbursts of desperation by oppressed slaves made the planters tremble with fear. Almost every plantation had its own cache of weapons, and groups of planters maintained guard squads that prowled the roads at night. The whole social system in the southern states, Foner remarks, rested on the direct suppression of the Negroes by force of arms. Negro slaves expressed their protest in other forms, such as defacing implements of labor, killing overseers and masters, suicide, escape, etc. Escape required great courage and bravery on the part of the Negro, for if a runaway slave was caught, his ears were cut off, and sometimes, if he offered armed resistance, his hands as well, or he was branded with a red-hot iron. Slave escapes from plantations became especially widespread during the Revolution of 1774 to 1783. Negroes played an important role in the struggle of the American colonies against English rule. George Washington, who had long been hesitant to recruit blacks as soldiers, was forced to resort to this measure in 1776 in view of the English offensive and the general dire situation in the country. According to some estimates, there were at least 5,000 Negroes in Washington's army. The invention of the cotton cleaning machine, gin, which accelerated the cleaning of cotton many times over, caused the rise of cotton farming and greatly increased the demand for slaves, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and later in the United States, further increased the demand for both cotton and slaves. The price of a slave rose from $300 in 1795 to $900 in 1849 and to $1,500 to $2,000 on the eve of the Civil War. The intensification of slave labor and the exploitation of slaves increased dramatically. All this led to a new aggravation and a new rise in the Negro liberation movement. The wave of Negro uprisings that swept the entire southern United States in the first half of the 19th was connected, in addition, with the revolutionary movement of Negroes in the West Indies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By the mid-19th century, slavery had become obsolete. The invention of spinning machines and the introduction of various technical improvements increased industrial productivity and dramatically increased the demand for cotton. The labor of slaves, even under the condition of their cruelest exploitation, remained unproductive, and their productivity did not meet the new requirements of industry. The planters, however, were not about to give up power voluntarily. In 1820, as a result of the Missouri Compromise, they secured the establishment of a slavery boundary. In 1850, under planter pressure, Congress passed a new Fugitive Slave Act, much harsher than the 1793 law. The pre-emerging outbreak of civil war in the United States was the Kansas Civil War, followed by John Brown's Rebellion, 1859. Brown, 1800 to 1859, a white farmer from Richmond, Ohio, a prominent abolitionist and secret road activist, had the idea of marching into Virginia, raising a general slave revolt, and forming a free state in the mountains of Maryland and Virginia as a base for the struggle to free all slaves. On the night of the 16th of October, 1859, Brown, with a small force of 22 men, 5 of them Negroes, moved on the town of Harper's Ferry and captured the arsenal. However, John Brown's campaign was not sufficiently prepared. Left without support, Brown's detachment was surrounded and after a fierce battle was defeated. The badly wounded John Brown was captured, charged with treason and inciting slaves to mutiny, and sentenced to hang. In his final speech at his trial, Brown denied all the charges against him and pleaded guilty to only one charge: intending to free the slaves. The execution of John Brown caused an explosion of outrage around the world, and brought closer the crisis that erupted in 1861. The planters struck first, in 1860, after the election of Lincoln, the representative of the North, as president. They announced the secession of a number of Southern states from the Union, and in early 1861 they attacked Northern troops at Fort Sumter. Thus began the Civil War between the North and the South. After the victory of the Northerners and the emancipation of the Negroes, the most important question became the question of reorganizing all political and economic life in the South, the question of Reconstruction of the South. In March 1865, the Bureau of Refugees, Freed Negroes, and Abandoned Lands was established. However, the Negroes were freed without ransom, but also without land and without means of subsistence. Large plantation land ownership was not destroyed. The political power of the slaveholders was only shaken for a time, but not broken. And although the Negroes themselves took part in the struggle for their emancipation with arms in their hands, although over 200,000 Negroes fought in the Army of the North, and 37,000 of them fell in the war, the Negroes did not obtain real freedom, much less equality. Freed from slavery to the planters, they fell in with the same planters and were compelled to work for their former masters on bonded terms as indentured laborers or tenants. "Slavery is abolished, long live slavery," was how one of the reactionary figures of that era defined the situation. After Lincoln's assassination on the 14th of April, 1865, and the rise to power of Johnson, who pursued a policy of concessions to the planters, reaction in the Southern states reared its head again. In 1865 to 1866, the so-called Black Codes were introduced in various Southern states, which essentially restored slavery to blacks. According to the Apprentice Law, all Negroes under the age of 18, without parents or children of poor parents, poor minors, were given into the service of whites, who could forcibly keep them in service, return them in case of escape by court, and subject them to corporal punishment. Negroes were allowed only for the heaviest and dirtiest labor. In many states there were vagrant laws, under which Negroes who were not in regular employment were declared vagrants, imprisoned and sent to hard labor or forcibly returned to work for their former planters. Vagrancy laws were extremely widely enforced and were always interpreted in a way that suited the planters. The system of bonded peonage, the use of convict labor, flourished in the Southern states, often chained together and required to perform road building or other heavy labor in a particular state. In 1867 to 1868, Congress approved the Southern Reconstruction Acts, which divided the Southern states into 5 military districts and imposed a military dictatorship there, enforced by troops from the North. The states elected their provisional government on the basis of universal suffrage, including blacks, with Confederates, formerly active participants in the rebellion, disenfranchised. Negroes found themselves elected to a number of state legislatures. Thus, G. Eptica points out that in the state of Mississippi after the elections of 1870 in the House of Representatives were 30 Negroes, and in the Senate, 5. But the main task of the Revolution, redistribution of land, destruction of the plantation economy, and thereby the political and economic power and domination of slaveholders, was not solved. This gave reaction in the Southern states the opportunity to gather forces and go on the offensive. Numerous terrorist groups began to form, committing murders, beatings, and other acts of violence against Negroes and their white allies and inciting racial hatred. Having achieved their aims and fearing a further deepening of the revolution, the northern bourgeoisie struck a deal with the slave owners to organize a united front against the labor and farm movement and the national liberation struggle of the Negro people. By the 80s of the 19th century, a conspiracy between the big capitalists of the North and the planters of the South had taken shape, which bears the name in history of the Compromise, or Betrayal, of Hayes-Tilden, 1877. Hayes, the presidential candidate of the Republican Party, the party of the northern bourgeoisie, received the support of the planters and was elected president after promising to withdraw northern troops from the South. With this compromise, the Reconstruction period ended. Most blacks continued to work as sharecroppers in the cotton fields and on farms, often owned by previous owners or their children. The sharecropping system that developed in the southern states after the Civil War placed the tenant entirely at the mercy of the landowner. The sharecropper had no property, no land, no means of production, no livestock, no money, nothing but labor. The sharecroppers lived in deep poverty, paying the planter half or sometimes two-thirds of their crops for the right to use the land. At the same time, everywhere in the southern states, black codes were being reinstated and laws were being enacted to deprive blacks of voting and civil rights on one pretext or another. Segregation of Negroes and whites in public places, in schools, and so on, is again established.